I'm Priscilla Barrera with the Investing News Network, and here with me today is Caspar Rawles, Senior Analyst at Benchmark Mineral Intelligence. Caspar, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me.
All right, so we are here at the end of 2019. To start, can you just give us an overview of what's been happening with mega factories in 2019 and what has changed since the beginning of the year?
Yeah, sure. So we've continued to see a large number of announcements throughout the year, pretty consistently. I think in January we were looking at around 1.5 terawatt hours of capacity that we were tracking out to 2028. I think around 70 battery plants. Now we're tracking more than 2 terawatt hours, just over 2 terawatt hours, and over 100 battery plants now. Obviously that speaks for itself in terms of capacity, but it represents probably about $40 billion worth of investment to get to that. So just in this year alone, that's probably more investment than we've seen further upstream, perhaps even altogether. So a lot of focus on investment in that part of the supply chain.
All right, and did any trends in the mega factory space surprise you or maybe disappointed you?
I think, I don't know, I think it's kind of, certainly seen Europe start to blossom as the next battery production facility. We've been saying that for a while, but that story has gained even more momentum. I think there's been a big push from governments to help that happen, but also obviously from companies who are looking to capitalize on being close to the major automakers within Europe. And then, of course, China's still dominating, which isn't that surprising. I guess one thing, we haven't really seen huge additions in North America yet, which is something that supply chain needs to build out, and something we're looking at and tracking closely.
All right, and in terms of the cathode mix for these mega factories, what are you seeing for the current mega factories and for the ones that are planned?
Yeah, so there is, that push towards high nickel is happening. I think, largely speaking, current plants are not, what we're not seeing is that they're getting rid of their production lines which can do, say, 523 or 622 cathodes. They're keeping those, and we're seeing that really it's the newer plants that are bringing that online, so they're not converting over. It will be the ones that are either just coming into production now, or commissioning the facility, or those that will be happening in the next few years. Because really, although we're starting to see kind of a slight uptake of that 811 cathode type in China specifically, it's still quite limited, and the lines that are already existing can manage that, and they're still quite limited themselves as well, those lines. So until there's a much larger end market, in China being the first place, but the rest of the world after that, those lines aren't really required at the moment.
So let's stay for a second there with high nickel cathodes. Have you seen any improvements in those cathodes? Are the challenges still the same? And I know you just mentioned China is the sector where it's being implemented right now, but what do you see happening in 2020? Are we going to see it elsewhere? What's happening?
Yeah, so we've started to see high nickel cathodes being used in China primarily, mostly in China. Obviously, they've been used in this is for EV applications. Non-EV applications, high nickel is being used, but it's much smaller markets. Going forward into 2020, I think we'll see more of that cathode type being used within China itself. I still think it's probably a little bit early for the rest of the world, but from 2021 onwards, we'll start to see bigger volumes potentially being used outside of China. Now, there are still some challenges around it. It's still the same challenges that we've been talking about for a long time. So energy density is great, but it needs to be safe, and that's potentially a challenge for automakers who still need to qualify that material. So I think China's going to be the forefront of that adoption, and we have seen that happen towards the end of this year for some automakers in particular, and further adoption in China 2020, rest of the world probably 2021.
All right, so let's then talk a little bit about the impact on raw materials and, of course, cobalt. What do you expect for cobalt in 2020? Are there any factors that could impact negatively the battery metal next year?
Well, it's cobalt, right? Anything can happen, but I think actually next year we're looking at probably a fairly unexciting, shall I say, first half of the year. I think the market, prices have kind of started to turn now from the rises we saw from Matanda closure announcement back in August. And I think over the next kind of 6 to 8 months probably, the market will be fairly flat to where we are now, maybe slightly below. But the second half of the year, I think the market will probably start to feel that closure a bit more, so it will probably start to tighten, which is more positive outlook in terms of prices. On the negative side, unless some of the new projects surprise to the upside in terms of production, I don't really see there being too much downside from where we are today.
All right, and you just mentioned it, but obviously the biggest news in the space was the Mutanda closure. I know that the last time we spoke, you said, this was a reverse of fortunes for Cobalt. Do you expect positive sentiment to continue in 2020?
Yeah. I mean, so what we saw after the closure was that prices reacted. So we saw prices go up across the board for all of the cobalt products we tracked in our cobalt price assessment. But I would say over the last probably, 3 weeks from now, that market has certainly stabilised in October and has started to see some downside in pricing. Now, I think the likelihood is prices are going to go lower from where we are today, but not as low as we saw earlier this year, so potentially around the mid-teens for metal in dollars per pound. As I say, first 6 months of the year, there's probably nothing to create higher prices without some kind of surprise shock to the supply chain somewhere. But as we look post-summer and people start to think about sorting their supply for 2021, I think people will start to realise that actually the market's a bit tighter than we expected, and you might see prices start to rise.
All right, and let's talk a little bit about deals in the space. We saw a few supply deals in the cobalt space with Umicore and GM getting their cobalt from Glencore. What do you expect to see in the market next year? Will we see more M&A activity, more partnerships? And does it make sense in the current state of the market for cobalt to take that direction?
Yeah, I think so. I think there are a number of large deals that still need to happen, still large buyers that haven't finalised their supply for next year, but also the long term as well. That seems to be the path that the market's taking. It's a more secure path. It's one way that you can help to reduce some of the volatility in your raw material input prices. So I know there's a couple of deals that potentially could happen going forward. We've seen, there's rumours of oil companies rounding on the space as well, looking to get in a major way. So there's certainly potential for a lot of acquisitions, not just in cobalt, other parts of the supply chain as well. But I think, the reality is that automakers are now really, I feel like we've been saying this for a long time, but really are genuinely getting to the time where they're starting to produce full EVs in larger volumes. Example, Volkswagen started producing in November their ID.3. So, it's certainly a time where things are getting really, really serious, and that is very much on the cards, I think.
All right, and I also wanted to touch on supply chains. We talk a lot about supply coming from the DRC, China playing a big role in refining. What do you think are some of the obstacles for other regions, like maybe Europe and the US, to step up and develop their own supply chains for cobalt?
There's a lot of interest in people wanting to do that, so there shouldn't really be any obstacles. I think one of the obstacles is obviously competing on cost. You have to be able to bring production to market at the right cost, securing raw materials, particularly in cobalt. We've seen China being very aggressive in either securing mines or securing offtake in large volumes from particularly the DRC. There shouldn't really be any obstacles other than the economics, as I say, but it tends to take longer to do things in Europe and North America than it does in China, which is still by far, the centre of cobalt refining. So there's that competition. But as I say, there's loads of interest, not just from private companies or public companies, there's interest from governments as well. So lots of levers can be pulled by those governments to help that supply chain develop. But at the moment, it's still relatively unclear exactly what will happen.
All right, and my last question for you today. What are some of the factors that investors that are watching us today should pay attention to that could impact the cobalt space in 2020?
That's a good question. As always, updates on what's kind of happening in the DRC in terms of production volumes, any production problems, particularly for those new projects that I spoke about earlier that are coming online. And then, of course, how demand grows from the industry. So, again, what happens in those high nickel cathodes? That will be important in kind of the medium term. Just watch the market closely. Maybe subscribe to our reports. It's 2020 is when, kind of the year where I think we're getting to these really key times for automakers. So I think it'll be linked to growing demand for EVs, and as I say, kind of DRC ramp up as well.
All right, Caspar, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
All right, once again, I'm Priscilla Barrera with the Investing News Network, and here with me today is Caspar Rawles, Senior Analyst at Benchmark Mineral Intelligence.